Mississippi, 1855. Every Sunday, plantation owner Horace Vail sat in the front pew and watched Elias Tamba preach obedience, endurance, and salvation. Vail believed the sermons were helping keep the plantation under control. He never understood that the enslaved preacher, standing a few yards away, was using the pulpit as a command center, a hand against wood, a heel against the floor. A pause held 1 second too long. Those rhythms were not religious excitement. They were instructions. And before long, one man in the chapel began to recognize the pattern. The first sound was almost too ordinary to notice. Elias Tamba lowered his right hand onto the wooden pulpit. One knock. He continued preaching. Then came a pause. 2 slower knocks followed. Nobody in the rear pews turned their head. Nobody exchanged a glance. Nobody shifted toward the door. That absence of reaction was a part of the design. At the front of the chapel, Horace Vail sat with his hands resting across his waistcoat. He was 57, wealthy by Mississippi standards, and deeply satisfied with the arrangement before him. Vail owned the plantation, controlled the land surrounding it, and claimed legal authority over the black adults forced to labor there. Yet on Sundays, he allowed one of those men to stand above the congregation and speak. Vail considered this evidence of his own generosity. The reality was less flattering. Elias was allowed to preach because Vail believed religion could be used as another instrument of control. The sermons were expected to emphasize patience, endurance, submission to earthly suffering in exchange for reward beyond it. Vail wanted Christianity stripped of its demands for justice and reduced to something useful to a slaveholder. Elias understood the arrangement perfectly. He was 44 years old, tall and lean, with the hardened shoulders of a carpenter, and large hands scarred by years of working rough timber. His face was long, his eyes deep-set, his hair already beginning to gray at the temples. He had survived partly because men like Vail believed quietness meant obedience. Elias had learned to let them keep believing it. That Sunday his voice remained measured. "There is a road, prepared," he told the congregation, even when the eye cannot see it. His fingers touched the pulpit again. A short strike. A longer pause. Then another. Vail heard emphasis. The people farther back heard something else. They heard timing. They heard direction. They heard whether the instruction remained active. The system depended on a brutal fact about slavery. Enslavers watched black people constantly, but they often failed to actually understand them. They monitored movement, conversation gatherings, tools, food work, and sleep. Yet their own prejudice convinced them that intelligence capable of organized resistance would announce itself in a form they recognized. Elias exploited that assumption. No secret meeting followed the service. No one gathered behind a cabin to discuss a route. Nothing was written. There was no visible map to discover. By the time Elias stepped away from the pulpit, the essential instructions had already been delivered. Near the middle of the chapel sat Lucette Brice. She was 39 and worked primarily around the plantation laundry. She possessed the kind of discipline that made her easy for white supervisors to overlook. She did not whisper during sermons. She did not signal with her hands. She did not turn toward anyone after Elias changed rhythm. She simply listened. Occasionally, Elias looked across the congregation. Not directly at her. That would have been too obvious, but close enough. Lucette understood what he was checking. Had the signal been clear? Had the timing changed? Was there anything in the room that required him to stop? Her face remained still. Elias continued. Standing near the chapel entrance was Ansel Rourke. Unlike Vail, Rourke rarely appeared relaxed. He was 52 tall and narrow with a weathered face, in the rigid posture of a man accustomed to watching other people work. He supervised movement across the plantation and treated irregularity as a threat. For most of the sermon he seemed uninterested, but Elias never assumed indifference meant safety. That mistake could destroy everything. So the sermon continued exactly as expected. Elias spoke about suffering. He spoke about wilderness. He spoke about roads appearing where men thought none existed. The religious language gave him protection because Vale wanted to hear it. That was the deception at the center of the chapel. Elias did not hide his operation by avoiding the beliefs of his enslavers. He hid it inside those beliefs. If you're listening from somewhere, this history still carries weight. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And as you follow Elias deeper into this story, ask yourself this: if the people controlling your every movement also controlled the places where you were allowed to speak, how would you turn one of those places against them? By late afternoon, the chapel was empty. Elias was back at work. A section of flooring near the pulpit had loosened, and he was told to repair it before the following Sunday. There was something almost obscene about the task. He was being forced to maintain the physical structure that Vale believed reinforced obedience. Elias knelt beside the damaged board, worked a tool beneath it, checked the grain, and fitted the replacement piece. His hands moved with practiced precision. That same wood had carried signals only hours earlier. Vale saw a carpenter repairing a chapel. Elias saw infrastructure. Night settled without any unusual commotion. That was deliberate, too. People ate. Work ended. Doors closed. From the main house, nothing appeared wrong. There was no sudden movement toward the tree line. No cluster forming near the edge of the quarters. No alarm. The plantation seemed quiet. Then midnight approached. Movement began in fragments. One person left a cabin without calling to anyone. Another crossed a workyard separately. Someone else waited until the ordinary noises of the plantation had settled before moving toward darker ground. The escape did not begin as a group, because grouping was exactly what patrols expected. The coordination had occurred hours earlier, inside the chapel, in full view of the men who believed they controlled it. By dawn, the absence could no longer be ignored. Vale demanded explanations. Supervisors checked the perimeter. Rourke examined the routes leading away from the living quarters and questioned those who had remained. There was no single departure point. That irritated him. Vale reached for the explanation that protected his pride. Someone outside the plantation must have organized it. Perhaps free black people farther away. Perhaps another network operating beyond the property. Perhaps someone had entered unnoticed and delivered instructions secretly. The possibility that the planning had happened during a service Vale himself had attended did not occur to him. He had watched Elias preach. He had heard every word. Therefore, in Vale's mind, nothing secret could have happened. That conclusion rested entirely on the assumption that words were the only language being used. Rourke was less certain. He walked through the chapel after the search outside produced little. The room was empty. Morning light exposed the rough benches, the plain walls, and the repaired section of flooring. Nothing looked like a command center. That was what disturbed him. Rourke stopped beside the pulpit. He placed one hand against the wood. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he tapped it once with his knuckle. The sound was dry and sharp. He tapped again. Something in his expression changed. Not recognition. Not yet. Memory. He had heard that sound the day before. More than once. Rourke looked toward the empty pews. He tried to reconstruct the sermon. Vale remembered scripture. Rourke remembered pauses. A certain rhythm had appeared when Elias spoke about roads. Another had followed language about darkness. At the time, Rourke had dismissed it as preaching style. Now he was no longer certain. Outside, Elias crossed the yard carrying woodworking tools. He saw Rourke standing inside the chapel. Elias did not slow down. He did not look twice. That discipline mattered more than courage in that moment. Because if Rourke was beginning to suspect the pulpit, the most dangerous thing Elias could do was show that the suspicion frightened him. So he kept walking. Rourke remained beside the wood. He tapped it again. Once. Pause. Twice. The escape itself had already succeeded, but the larger danger had just begun. For the first time, someone on Horace Vale's plantation was no longer listening to Elias Tamba as a preacher. Ansel Rourke had begun listening for the code. Rourke's suspicion changed the danger, but it did not create the system. That had begun months earlier, when Elias first understood that the plantation chapel offered something almost nowhere else. Did a predictable gathering of fixed audience and permission to make sound. The permission was narrow. That was what made it useful. Horace Vale controlled the sermons. He wanted scripture about endurance, obedience, suffering, and reward after death. He wanted religion reduced to a structure that demanded patience from the enslaved, while demanding nothing from the enslaver. Elias accepted the restriction because it gave him access to the pulpit. The first experiments did not happen during worship. They happened during carpentry. Elias spent long hours repairing fences, doors, stalls, and floorboards. When another worker passed nearby, Elias sometimes struck a wooden surface twice with the handle of a tool. Later he changed the spacing. A fast pair meant one thing. The same two strikes separated by a longer pause meant something else. At first the signals were crude. Work location. Danger nearby. Wait. Move. Nothing more. Elias discovered quickly that the sound itself was not difficult to hide. Labor created noise constantly. Wood struck wood. Tools hit posts. Boots crossed planks. Buckets dropped. Wagon parts rattled. The greater problem was interpretation. A signal simple enough to remember could also become simple enough to detect. Lucette Brice was the first person to tell him that directly. They were standing behind the laundry structure late one afternoon. Elias had come to repair a warped doorframe. Lucette was wringing water from a heavy length of cloth. He tapped the frame. 2 strikes. Pause. 1 strike. Lucette did not look at him. Too clean, she said. Elias stopped working. She continued folding the cloth. Too clean for what? For something you don't want heard. That was how their partnership developed. Not through ceremony. Not through declarations. Through correction. Lucette had spent years surviving by observing patterns other people ignored. Laundry work placed her near clothing kitchens, service paths, stable traffic, household schedules, and the changing routines of supervisors. She knew which sounds attracted attention and which disappeared into ordinary plantation noise. More importantly, she understood how people watched. Enslavers were suspicious of whispers. They were suspicious of meetings. They were suspicious of repeated words, but they were far less suspicious of pauses. Lucette told Elias the code could not depend only on what was sounded. It had to depend on what was withheld. That changed everything. The system became layered. Tempo could indicate time. A steady, slow rhythm might refer to movement after work had fully ended. A quicker pattern could mean the window had narrowed. Accent mattered too. A stronger first strike could indicate one direction. A stronger final strike could reverse it. But the most important element was silence. A pause inserted at the wrong place could cancel an instruction. A longer break could mean a route was unsafe. Two familiar patterns, separated by an unusual silence, could transform what appeared to be a movement signal into a warning not to move at all. This made the system difficult to understand from fragments. An observer could memorize the knocks and still misunderstand the message. That was exactly what Lucette wanted. They'll listen for the beating, she told Elias one evening. Then she looked toward the main house. We listen to what comes between. From that point forward, Elias stopped thinking of the signals as individual commands. He thought of them as structures. No single sound was allowed to carry enough meaning by itself. That reduced the danger if someone overheard one section. It also forced discipline on everyone who learned it. The code could not work if people guessed. They had to wait for confirmation. The chapel gave Elias another layer: congregational response. Vale liked loud participation because he mistook it for religious enthusiasm. Elias used that assumption. A response arriving immediately after a phrase could confirm understanding. A delayed response could indicate uncertainty. If Lucette sensed danger in the room, she could withhold her own response, and others who knew the system would follow. To Vale, a quieter congregation simply meant a weaker sermon. To Elias, it could mean abort. The brilliance of the arrangement was not technical complexity for its own sake. It was camouflage built from the expectations of the people enforcing slavery. The more Vale believed he understood black worship, the less carefully he examined it. That arrogance became operational cover. Elias and Lucette were careful not to teach the system as a single lesson. That would have created another vulnerability. Instead, people learned pieces over time: a rhythm during work, a pause during worship, a directional cue tied to a familiar feature of the landscape, a response pattern practiced inside ordinary religious call and answer. Nothing written, nothing complete in one place, nothing that could simply be taken. Lucette also refused to let the system become dependent on Elias alone. This was a source of tension between them. Elias knew the risks of decentralizing it. More people understanding the method meant more chances for error. Lucette saw the opposite danger. If only Elias could issue signals, then removing Elias would end everything. She pushed the network outward, quietly. Adults who understood timing learned how to confirm timing to others. Those who knew one safe approach to the woods learned how to recognize whether that route had been canceled. People were not taught to recite a code. They were taught to recognize relationships between sound silence and context. That distinction would later matter more than either Elias or Rourke understood. The emotional bond between Elias and Lucette grew inside that work. There was no space for romance in the ordinary sense. Their lives were controlled by labor schedules, surveillance, and the threat of separation. What existed between them was more restrained and more severe: trust. Elias listened when Lucette told him he was wrong. Lucette trusted him to stand at the most visible point in the chapel and not lose control. Sometimes, after the others had gone, they sat apart from each other in the same work area, without speaking. That silence was not empty. It was one of the few things they could claim without permission. By autumn, the system had become more reliable. It also became more dangerous. Success always increases exposure. Elias noticed changes in the plantation's routines after certain sermons. Not enough to prove surveillance. Enough to require caution. A mounted patrol returned earlier than expected one evening. A supervisor lingered near the chapel after worship. Rourke began appearing in places where he had previously shown little interest. Lucette noticed it too. One Sunday, Elias gave a familiar sequence during a sermon about crossing difficult ground. The congregation responded normally. Vale looked bored. Rourke did not. His head lifted slightly. Elias continued speaking. The rhythm returned later, in the sermon altered by a pause. Rourke's eyes moved to Elias's hand. It was a small movement, almost nothing. Lucette saw it. After worship, she waited until the yard had cleared before passing Elias near the side of the chapel. He heard that one. Elias kept walking. He hears everything, no, Lucette said. This time he remembered. That distinction mattered. Rourke had encountered military drilling earlier in his life. He understood that rhythm could organize movement without long, verbal commands. He knew repeated structures were rarely accidental when they appeared in the same context. He began listening differently, not to scripture, to recurrence. A rhythm used during one sermon appeared again weeks later. A particular cadence seemed to precede unusual activity near the edge of the plantation. A different structure appeared on nights when nothing followed. Rourke did not yet know what the patterns meant, but he was beginning to understand that they meant something. He tested the idea privately. After one Sunday service, he altered the placement of a patrol, not enough to expose his suspicion, just enough to see whether behavior changed. Elias noticed the patrol. Lucette noticed that Elias noticed it. Neither reacted. That was the discipline the system required. But from then on, the chapel was no longer simply a place where information could be hidden. It had become a contested space. On the next Sunday, Rourke entered before the service began. Instead of taking his usual place near the door, he walked farther inside. He stopped only a few steps from the pulpit. Elias saw him. Lucette saw him too. Vale noticed nothing unusual. Elias opened the sermon. His voice remained steady. Then his hand came down against the wood. Rourke's eyes dropped immediately to the pulpit. He was no longer wondering whether the rhythm existed. He had started trying to learn its language. Rourke changed his position before Elias said the first word. He moved from the chapel door to the front wall, close enough to see the pulpit clearly, and far enough to pretend he was only supervising the room. Vale noticed the change and approved of it. To him, Rourke's presence represented discipline. To Elias, it represented penetration. The sermon began with Exodus. That choice had been deliberate long before Rourke became suspicious. Biblical stories of bondage, wilderness, and deliverance could be preached in ways Vale considered harmless, provided Elias emphasized endurance rather than rebellion. Elias understood the hypocrisy built into that permission. A slaveholder could listen to a story about captivity ending and still imagine it had nothing to do with the people sitting behind him. That blindness had protected Elias for months. Rourke was beginning to damage it. Elias spoke slowly. His hands rested on the pulpit. For several minutes he gave no signal. The congregation remained still. Lucette sat near the middle aisle, her posture unchanged. Rourke watched Elias's fingers. Then Elias raised his voice on a familiar phrase. His palm came down once. A brief pause. 2 strikes followed. Rourke's eyes moved immediately. Elias saw it. He did not change pace. That was the first test. If Elias stopped whenever Rourke looked at him, suspicion would become proof. So he repeated the pattern later in the sermon, exactly where it had been planned. Rourke did not watch the congregation. He watched the wood. This was new. After the service, he did not question Elias. He did something more dangerous. He waited. That afternoon, he altered the position of one patrol near the lower fields. He moved another rider closer to a narrow route leading toward wooded ground. No arrests, no accusations, only adjustment. The plantation continued operating as though nothing had changed. Elias noticed the patrol shift before sunset. He did not tell anyone immediately. He spent the evening repairing a split wagon support working beside men who knew nothing of the full signal structure. The danger was not merely that Rourke had heard a rhythm. The danger was that he was testing meaning. That required a different response. Lucette confirmed it the next morning. A supervisor, who normally remained near the storage buildings, had spent part of the night near the tree line. No one had been stopped. Nothing had been discovered. That meant Rourke had probably not been hunting a person. He had been hunting a prediction. Elias understood the distinction. Rourke was treating the sermons as intelligence. The next Sunday, Elias changed nothing obvious. That was essential. But he altered the internal structure of the message. A rhythm that had previously indicated movement was paired with a longer pause. The intended meaning became delay. Rourke heard the familiar knocks. He reacted as Elias expected. That night, patrols were positioned near one route. Nobody moved. Rourke learned something from that too. He did not know the exact message, but he now understood that the rhythm did not always produce action. He began separating recurring structures in his memory. One pattern appeared repeatedly before activity near the woods. Another seemed to precede quiet nights. A third was associated with lower ground and routes that became usable after rain. Rourke had spent enough time around military drilling years earlier to understand the basic principle. Sound did not need to form language to control movement. A drum beat could regulate pace. A repeated cadence could signal formation. A change in rhythm could alter behavior without a shouted command. He did not need to understand Elias's entire system. He only needed to identify correlations. That was how the threat advanced. Rourke stopped thinking like a guard. He started thinking like an analyst. He watched sermons over several weeks. He no longer cared which verses Elias chose. He cared when Elias accelerated, when he struck the pulpit, when the congregation answered quickly, when they answered slowly, when Lucette remained silent. Elias noticed the pattern of observation tightening. The chapel had once given him an advantage because Vale heard theology, while the others heard instructions. Now Rourke was stripping away the theological disguise. Not completely, but enough. The pressure became visible outside worship. Patrols changed after certain Sundays. Horses were moved without explanation. A route that had been left loosely watched for months was suddenly covered. Then, after another sermon, a different section of the property received attention. Rourke was mapping reactions. Elias began using false familiarity. He repeated safe rhythms during ordinary days. He tapped old patterns while repairing fences. He allowed Rourke to hear structures with no operational meaning attached. The purpose was contamination. If every familiar rhythm produced action, the code would become easier to isolate. If familiar rhythms appeared inside meaningless noise, Rourke would have to distinguish signal from imitation. It slowed him. It did not stop him. One Sunday, Rourke came earlier than usual. He stood close enough that Elias could see the pale line of tension around his mouth. Vale sat in the front pew, unaware that the most important contest in the room had nothing to do with religion. Elias opened with a passage about crossing difficult ground. He increased the tempo gradually. Lucette recognized the sequence. So did Rourke. That was the problem. Elias could tell from the way Rourke's head lifted. The overseer had heard this pattern before. The congregation answered. Rourke looked toward the rear pews for the first time. Not at everyone, at individuals. He was beginning to understand that the system required receivers. Elias immediately changed the structure. A longer pause. A softer strike. Then normal speech. Lucette did not respond. Several others followed her silence. Rourke saw that too. He had not decoded the message, but he had witnessed a relationship. That was enough to advance the investigation. After worship, Rourke left without speaking. Elias remained behind under the excuse of checking a loose hinge near the pulpit. Lucette passed the doorway once carrying folded cloth. She did not stop. Elias waited until she was beyond sight before leaving. That evening, the expected patrol pattern changed again. Rourke had positioned men near the lower ground, the exact area connected to one of the recurring rhythms. This was the first time Elias could no longer dismiss the possibility. Rourke had isolated one structural meaning. Not perfectly, but close enough to become dangerous. Lucette met Elias briefly behind the laundry building after dark. There was no argument, no panic, only assessment. "He has 3, she said. Elias knew what she meant. 3 recognizable structures. 3 points of entry into the system. How much enough to test us? That was worse than certainty. A man who believed he fully understood the code might make mistakes confidently. A man still testing it would remain cautious. Rourke's restraint made him more dangerous than Vale. Vale wanted control to be visible. Rourke wanted understanding. The difference would determine what happened next. Elias considered abandoning the chapel system entirely. Lucette rejected it immediately. If the rhythms disappeared now, Rourke would know his suspicion was correct. The silence itself would become confession. So Elias continued preaching. The next service was colder. Rourke stood closer. His attention never left Elias's hands. Elias delivered a familiar sequence near the middle of the sermon. Rourke recognized it. Then he did something Elias had not expected. Nothing. No visible reaction. No movement after the service. No immediate patrol shift. For 2 days, the plantation remained normal. That absence of response disturbed Elias more than another trap would have. On the 3rd evening, he saw why. Rourke had stopped testing the code openly. He had begun hiding his own reactions. The contest had changed again. Rourke no longer wanted Elias to know what he understood. And then, he made the decision that exposed the seriousness of his suspicion. He spoke privately with Vale. Vale expected a recommendation to remove Elias from the pulpit. Rourke advised the opposite. Let the sermons continue. Let Elias keep tapping. Let the congregation keep answering. Vale agreed because he still believed the chapel was harmless. Rourke agreed because he no longer believed that at all. He had decided not to arrest Elias. Not yet. A prisoner could be silenced. A preacher left in place could lead him to everyone else. Rourke's decision to leave Elias in place created a new kind of danger. Until then, surveillance had been about discovery. Now it was about exploitation. Rourke no longer needed to prove that the sermons carried information. He only needed to let Elias believe the system still worked, then position men where the signals appeared to point. That required patience. For the next 2 Sundays, Rourke did almost nothing. He remained in the chapel. He watched. He did not move patrols immediately afterward. He did not question anyone. He did not alter the stable routine in a way Elias could easily read. The lack of pressure was deliberate. Rourke wanted the network to resume normal behavior. That was the first trap. The second was geographical. A narrow route along the eastern edge of the plantation had been watched inconsistently for months. It passed beyond worked ground, crossed a drainage cut, then entered a wooded section where visibility collapsed quickly after dark. Elias knew the route. So did Lucette. They had avoided it recently because Rourke had increased movement there. Then the patrols disappeared. Not gradually. They simply stopped appearing. For several evenings, no mounted supervisor used the eastern track. One guard who normally crossed the drainage cut before nightfall was reassigned. A stable worker reported that 2 riding horses remained untouched. The route looked open. That was what made Lucette suspicious. Real weakness on a plantation rarely appeared cleanly. Men got tired. Schedules slipped. Weather interfered. Someone became distracted. Those gaps were irregular. This one looked designed. Lucette began watching what happened around the apparent opening rather than the opening itself. She noticed that one of Rourke's usual riding horses was no longer visible in its stall late in the afternoon. That alone meant little. Then a second detail appeared. Two white supervisors, who normally remained near the main work areas, disappeared before evening, without explanation. No unusual orders were given. No increased activity followed. The plantation became quieter. Too quiet. Lucette had learned long ago that organized violence often announced itself not by noise, but by the sudden removal of ordinary noise. Men preparing to wait in darkness did not want to be seen preparing. She found Elias near a repair shed before sunset. He was fitting a metal brace to a damaged gate. She passed without stopping. East is closed. Elias kept working. No one is there. That is why. She moved on. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it changed the operation. The following Sunday, Elias was scheduled to transmit timing connected to movement through that side of the property. Canceling the message should have been simple. It was not. By now, Rourke was no longer merely hearing rhythms. He was waiting for specific rhythms. If a familiar pattern disappeared immediately after the eastern route became suspicious, Rourke could infer that Elias had detected the trap. That would reveal another layer of the system. It would show that information moved back toward the pulpit as efficiently as it moved away from it. Elias met Lucette after dark in a storage passage behind the laundry building. They kept several feet between them. The conversation was short. "We stop it." Lucette shook her head. "If we stop now, he learns. He may already know. He knows one road. That is enough." "No. He thinks it is enough." That distinction became the center of their disagreement. Elias's instinct was protective. If a route was compromised, nobody should move. Lucette was thinking beyond the night itself. Rourke had spent weeks building confidence in his interpretation. If they abandoned every operation the moment he positioned men correctly, he would refine the code faster. He needed to be punished for understanding it, not confronted, misled. Lucette proposed using the same pattern Rourke expected to hear. Let him recognize it. Let him believe it confirmed the eastern route, then alter the pauses. To the people trained in the full structure, the message would become a warning. To Rourke, who had focused on repeated beats, it would appear to be confirmation. Elias saw the risk immediately. If anyone listening missed the altered silence, they could walk directly into the trap. Lucette had already considered that. No movement would begin from the sermon alone. A second confirmation would be required later. Anyone who did not receive it would remain where they were. The system had been designed for exactly this kind of pressure. Now they were going to use that redundancy not just for protection, but deception. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "This changes what we are doing." "Yes, from hiding to lying." Lucette's expression did not change. They lied first. There was no argument after that. On Sunday morning, the chapel filled normally. Vale arrived early and sat in front. Rourke stood near the side wall. His posture was controlled. He had learned to conceal recognition. That did not matter anymore. Elias no longer needed to read his face. He already knew what Rourke wanted. The sermon began quietly. Elias avoided Exodus this time. He spoke instead about judgment endurance and the danger of trusting what appears open simply because no obstacle can be seen. Vale heard religious caution. Rourke heard background noise. Then Elias began the sequence. One firm strike. Pause. Two softer beats. The pattern Rourke had connected to the eastern route. Nothing moved in the congregation. Elias continued. Later he repeated the pattern, but the silence after the first strike lasted longer than before. That pause changed the meaning. East was not the route. East was watched. Do not move there. Lucette heard it. So did those who had been taught to listen for absence as carefully as sound. Rourke heard the beats. That was enough for him. He did not look toward the door. He did not signal anyone. He kept his face neutral. But after the service, he left before Vale. That confirmed everything Lucette needed to know. The trap was active. By late afternoon, the plantation looked ordinary. Elias worked. Lucette remained near the laundry. No one gathered. Rourke's men were already moving. They took positions beyond the eastern drainage cut, where they could not be easily seen from the main grounds. One man waited near the first line of trees. Another remained farther back with horses. Rourke chose distance over visibility. He expected movement after dark. He wanted the people following Elias's signal to enter the corridor before realizing they were surrounded. Elias knew only part of this. Lucette saw more. At dusk, she noticed the empty stable space again. Then she saw a saddle blanket missing from its peg. The plantation itself was confirming what the sermon had warned. There would be no movement east. The critical question was what came next. They could simply wait and let Rourke's men return empty-handed. Lucette rejected that too. An empty trap might make him cautious. A convincing false trail could make him confident. Confidence was more useful. The next phase would require Elias to give Rourke something he thought he understood completely. That night, no one entered the eastern corridor. Rourke waited for hours. He returned before dawn with nothing. But he did not conclude that the signal had been false. He concluded that timing had changed. That was exactly the error Lucette wanted him to make. By the following Sunday, Rourke was ready to listen again. So was Elias. He stepped behind the pulpit. Lucette sat where she could see both him and the overseer. Vale settled into the front pew, still believing the chapel belonged to him. Elias placed hand on the wood. This time the message would not merely be hidden from Rourke. It would be built specifically for him. One sermon, two audiences, and only one of them was meant to leave with the truth. Rourke came into the chapel already believing he had learned how to listen. That belief was now more useful to Elias than ignorance had ever been. The room filled, as it always did. Vale took the front pew. Rourke stood off to the side close enough to see Elias's hands without appearing unusually interested. Lucette sat where she could watch both men. Nothing in the arrangement looked different. The deception depended on that. Elias opened with a passage about false certainty. Vale heard a warning against pride before God. Rourke heard theology. Then Elias touched the pulpit. One firm strike. A short pause. Two softer strikes. Rourke knew the sequence. His expression barely changed, but his shoulders settled. That was enough. He believed the eastern route was active again. Elias continued speaking. Several minutes later, he repeated the same beat structure. This time, the silence before the final strike lasted longer. The congregation understood the difference. Rourke did not. To him, the repetition strengthened the message. To those who knew the full system, the altered pause reversed it. East was watched. Wait for the second route. Nothing in the room betrayed that understanding. Lucette kept her eyes forward. Elias never looked toward the rear pews. Vale seemed pleased with the sermon. The entire mechanism operated inside the confidence of the men trying to suppress it. That was the essential weakness of plantation surveillance. It depended not only on force but on the assumption that the people being watched were intellectually simpler than the people doing the watching. Rourke was smarter than Vail, but he was still making the same mistake. He believed the code was something he could extract from Elias by observing enough repetitions. He did not yet understand that Elias and Lucette had deliberately given him repetitions to extract. After the service, Rourke left early. He avoided the eastern track. That was another confirmation. Lucette waited until Vail had gone, before crossing the yard toward the laundry. She did not speak to Elias. They had already done enough. The next stage depended on everyone else. Near dusk, Rourke sent men beyond the eastern drainage cut. He positioned them farther back this time. The previous failure had taught him not to sit directly on the suspected route. Instead, he created depth. One group waited near the wooded edge. Another held farther behind. If movement entered the corridor, Rourke intended to let it pass the first position before closing the rear. He was no longer simply trying to interrupt an escape. He wanted to capture the structure behind it. Elias had anticipated the possibility. That was why the real route did not begin near the chapel or the cabins. People moved separately, through ordinary work areas first. No cluster, no rush, no visible departure. A person crossed toward a livestock enclosure. Another carried something toward a workshed. Someone else disappeared behind a line of outbuildings and did not return. Rourke's attention remained east. That was where he believed intelligence had pointed him. Lucette watched his preparations from a distance. She did not need to know the exact positions of every man. She only needed to confirm that Rourke had committed enough attention to the false route. When she saw one of the stable hands bring out another horse after dark, she knew the deception had taken hold. The second signal was not given from the pulpit. That was important. A faint, ordinary rhythm was passed through his work noise near the rear sheds. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have seemed meaningful to an outsider. Those waiting for confirmation now had it. The actual movement turned away from the eastern corridor. It went toward lower ground, where Rourke had reduced supervision to strengthen his false interception point. That was the reversal. Rourke believed he had forced Elias into a predictable route. In reality, Elias and Lucette had used his belief to make the plantation predictable. For several hours, Rourke waited. The first position saw nothing. Neither did the second. No one entered the corridor. At first, Rourke did not move. He assumed the timing was late. Then he assumed something had delayed the departure. Near midnight, one of his men quietly returned to report that the track remained empty. Rourke ordered him back. He continued waiting. The longer the route stayed empty, the more difficult it became to preserve the theory that the code had been read correctly. Then another problem appeared. A horse returned from the western side of the plantation, without the supervisor who had taken it out. There had been confusion near a low crossing. Not an ambush, not a confrontation. Simply movement where Rourke had not expected movement to occur. By the time he shifted men away from the eastern route, the opportunity was gone. No mass flight, no obvious trail, only absence. That was what humiliated him. A visible confrontation could have been explained. This could not. Rourke had listened carefully. He had recognized a pattern. He had acted on it. And the result had been worse than ignorance. Someone had anticipated his interpretation. The realization came slowly. The code had not merely escaped him. It had included him. He had been assigned a role without knowing it. That was the first true defeat Rourke suffered in the contest. Not because he had failed to hear the message, because he had heard exactly what Elias wanted him to hear. The next morning he entered the chapel alone. The pulpit remained unchanged. He placed his palm against the wood. Then he repeated the rhythm from memory. 1 strike. Pause. 2 strikes. He stopped. The structure still seemed correct. That made the failure more disturbing. If the beats were right, then something else had altered the meaning. Rourke began replaying the sermon in his head. Not the words, the spaces. He remembered one pause lasting longer, another arriving where he had not expected it. For the first time, he considered the possibility that silence was carrying information. That insight should have helped him. Instead, it widened the problem. If silence mattered, the number of possible meanings multiplied. A pause could reverse, delay, cancel, confirm. Rourke no longer knew how much of the system he actually understood. His response was not to abandon the investigation. He changed targets. Elias was too visible. Every eye naturally followed the preacher. That made him an obvious focus. But no communication system survives through a speaker alone. There must be listeners, interpreters, people who know when meaning has changed. Rourke began watching the congregation more carefully. Not during the loudest moments, during the pauses. He looked for those who remained still when others answered. Those who delayed responses. Those who seemed to understand a change before Elias repeated it. That was when Lucette became dangerous to him. She did almost nothing. That was precisely what drew his attention. During one service, Elias altered a familiar pattern. Several people shifted their responses. Lucette did not. A moment later, the others settled. Rourke saw the sequence. He could not prove she had directed anything. He did not need proof. He only needed a hypothesis. Over the next days, he began appearing near the laundry more often. Once he stood across the yard while Lucette worked and said nothing. Another time, he changed the route of a supervisor so that the man passed repeatedly near her work area. Lucette noticed. She did not react, but the pressure had moved. For months, Elias had carried the visible risk because he stood at the pulpit. Now, Rourke had begun to understand that the most important person in the room might not be the one making the sound. He had been deceived by the false sermon. He would not allow himself to be deceived the same way twice. Lucette saw him watching her late one afternoon. This time the stare lasted too long to dismiss. She lowered her hands back into the wash water and continued working. No fear on her face. No warning to Elias. Nothing Rourke could use. But she understood exactly what had happened. The trap had failed. The network had survived. And the cost of that victory was now moving toward her. Rourke did not confront Lucette immediately. That would have been too simple. Instead, he narrowed the space around her. A supervisor began appearing near the laundry at irregular hours. A man from the stable was reassigned to work, where he could see the path behind the wash house. Rourke himself crossed the yard without purpose, stopped within sight of Lucette, then continued walking. The message was deliberate. He wanted her to know she was being watched. Fear could reveal relationships faster than interrogation. Lucette gave him nothing. She worked at the same pace. She carried water along the same path. She spoke when work required it, and remained silent when it did not. But Elias saw the change. The next time they passed near each other, he did not need an explanation. Rourke had stopped watching only the pulpit. He was now watching the network around it. Elias responded by reducing activity. No major movement followed the next sermon. No unusual secondary signals appeared near the work areas. For several days, the plantation became quiet. Rourke interpreted that silence as pressure working. Elias understood the danger of allowing him to think so. The network could survive temporary restraint. What it could not survive was Rourke learning that every increase in surveillance produced predictable changes in behavior. If he could force the signals to stop by watching one person, he would eventually learn who mattered. Elias wanted to suspend everything until attention shifted. Lucette refused. They spoke briefly behind a storage shed while evening work was ending. "You are the reason he is waiting," Elias said. "That is why I cannot disappear. He already suspects you. Then stopping makes him certain." Elias looked toward the laundry yard. Rourke was nowhere visible. That meant little now. Lucette had already decided what came next. The network needed another movement window. Several adults had been waiting for a safe opportunity, and Rourke's increased focus on the chapel created an unexpected weakness elsewhere. The western work boundary was being watched less closely. Not abandoned, just reduced. Rourke had concentrated his attention where he believed information was generated. Lucette intended to make that concentration expensive. Her plan was not to create another false sermon. They had already used that method. Repeating it would make the story predictable for Rourke and dangerous for everyone else. This time, Lucette would make herself the signal. She began building a pattern of visible activity around the laundry. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. A bucket carried after dark. A folded cloth left near an outer shed and retrieved later. A brief walk behind the chapel after work. Small actions, each one harmless by itself. Rourke noticed them. That was the point. He began assigning significance where none existed. One evening, Lucette deliberately remained outside longer than usual. Rourke sent a man to follow the route she had taken. He found nothing. The following evening, she repeated part of the pattern, but ended somewhere else. Again, nothing. Rourke's suspicion grew rather than weakened. He had reached the stage where absence of proof no longer reduced his certainty. It increased it. That psychological shift gave Lucette the opening she needed. Rourke was no longer merely observing her. He was expecting her to lead him somewhere. Elias understood what she was preparing and objected again. He told her the next operation could wait. Lucette knew that was not true. Delay had consequences. Every postponed attempt increased exposure. Routes changed. Work assignments changed. Weather changed. People lost opportunities they might not receive again. More importantly, if the network became dependent on one safe moment chosen by Rourke's behavior, then Rourke already controlled it. Lucette would not accept that. The next Sunday service was intentionally restrained. Elias used only the necessary signal. No elaborate deception. No repeated structure designed for Rourke. The message was simple to those who understood the system. Prepare. Wait for confirmation outside the chapel. Rourke heard enough to become alert, but not enough to determine a route. That uncertainty shifted his attention toward Lucette, exactly as planned. After the service, she returned to the laundry. Nothing unusual happened for hours. Rourke waited. Near dusk, Lucette began moving. She carried a bundle toward a rear structure, returned, took an empty container toward the chapel's side, returned again. Then, after darkness settled, she crossed behind the laundry and disappeared briefly from the main yard. Rourke reacted. He sent one man after her, then another farther out. Lucette allowed herself to be seen near the chapel. She moved toward a storage area, paused there, then doubled back through the darker edge of the yard. From Rourke's position, the pattern looked like coordination. He committed more attention. That was the mistake she needed. While men watched Lucette, the real confirmation moved elsewhere. A short rhythm passed from one work area to another. No preacher, no pulpit, no sermon. Only the principals Elias and Lucette had spent months teaching. The western route became active. Movement began separately. No cluster formed. No one moved directly from the cabins toward freedom. They filtered through until ordinary movement became absence. Lucette stayed behind. That had not been part of what Elias believed they had agreed. He realized it when he reached the point where she should have joined the movement. She did not appear. He waited longer than he should have. Then he heard activity behind him. Not shouting, commands, horses shifting, men repositioning near the plantation yard. Rourke had finally decided that Lucette was not merely being watched. She was to be stopped. Elias turned back. From the edge of darker ground, he could see fragments of the yard through gaps between structures. Lucette was near the laundry. Rourke and two men had cut off the easiest paths away from it. She could still see the western edge. She could still see where Elias had stopped. For a moment, neither moved. Elias understood what she had done. The diversion had never required her to remain until the end. She had chosen to. If she left too soon, Rourke might shift men west. If she stayed, his attention would remain fixed on her. Until the real movement was beyond immediate pursuit, Elias took one step back toward the plantation. Lucette saw it. She shook her head. Once. No gesture toward herself. No plea. Only refusal. Elias stopped. That decision became the wound he would carry afterward. He could return and almost certainly expose the route others were using. Or he could continue and leave Lucette to absorb the consequence of a plan she had designed. There was no clean choice. Slavery specialized in creating situations where every available act carried damage. Elias turned away. He kept moving. Behind him, Lucette was taken into custody. There was no dramatic final exchange between them. No last speech. No promise. By morning, she had been removed from the plantation. Vale gave Elias no explanation beyond what power always offered when it considered explanation unnecessary. Lucette was gone. Where she was taken, Elias could not establish with certainty. He never saw her again. Rourke expected the removal to produce immediate results. He watched Elias closely over the following days. He expected panic, perhaps anger, perhaps an attempt to communicate quickly before the network collapsed. Elias gave him nothing. That required a level of control more punishing than any sermon had demanded. On Sunday, Vale ordered worship to continue. He wanted normality restored. That was another cruelty of the system. A woman could be torn away from the plantation, and the man who had worked beside her was still expected to stand before the same congregation and perform obedience for the people responsible. Elias entered the chapel. Rourke stood near the wall. Vale took his usual place. Elias approached the pulpit. For the first time since the system had begun, he hesitated before touching the wood. His hand stopped above it. Lucette's sentence returned to him. They will listen for the beating. We will listen to what comes between. Elias lowered his hand. He began preaching. No operational rhythm passed through the sermon that morning. Rourke interpreted the silence as victory. Lucette had been removed. The signals had stopped. The network, he believed, had lost one of its essential operators. But Elias understood something Rourke still did not. The confirmation used during the previous escape had not come from him. It had not come from Lucette. It had passed through ordinary work areas after both of them were already under observation. The method was functioning without its creators. Lucette had not sacrificed herself to protect Elias's control over the network. She had sacrificed herself because control no longer belonged to either of them. Rourke believed he had removed a central piece. In reality, He had arrived too late. The knowledge had already moved beyond the pulpit. Rourke waited for the network to collapse. For several days he believed it had. No clear signal came from the chapel. No suspicious movement followed worship. Lucette was gone. Elias continued working, preaching repairing wood, and speaking only when required. To Rourke, the silence looked like damage. That interpretation was convenient. It was also wrong. The first confrontation came after a Sunday service when Vale had already returned to the main house. Rourke remained behind. Elias was collecting a few tools near the pulpit when Rourke closed the chapel door. There was no audience, no congregation, no Lucette, only the two men in the structure that had concealed months of coordination. Rourke stood beside the front pew. "You used the sermons." Elias did not answer. The knocking, the pauses, the responses. Silence. Rourke stepped closer. "You think I didn't hear it?" Elias looked at him. "You heard something." It was the most Elias had admitted. Rourke's expression hardened. That single answer exposed the difference between them. Rourke wanted ownership of the truth. He wanted Elias to confirm that the patterns he had spent weeks studying were real, because proof would restore the authority the false sermon had damaged. Elias refused to give him that restoration. Rourke demanded the meaning of the rhythms. Elias gave him nothing. No explanation of tempo. No explanation of pauses. No description of how confirmation moved outside the chapel. No acknowledgement of Lucette's role. Rourke changed tactics. He claimed the system was finished anyway. Lucette was gone. The chapel was watched. The roots were covered. Elias listened. Rourke expected grief to create carelessness. It did not. The overseer had correctly identified Elias's loss. He had failed to understand its consequence. Lucette's removal had not made Elias desperate to preserve control. It had confirmed that control had to disappear entirely. Rourke left the chapel without obtaining the confession he wanted. His next move was physical. He searched the building, not casually. He ordered benches shifted. He inspected the flooring. He checked the underside of the pulpit and the wall behind it. He examined the joints Elias had repaired. Nothing. No hidden compartment. No concealed mechanism. No map. No written instructions. The absence frustrated Vale even more than Rourke. Vale had finally been told enough to understand that his Sunday services had been used against him. That humiliation mattered more to him than the method. For months he had sat in front of the pulpit, believing he was witnessing submission. The possibility that resistance had operated only a few yards behind him was intolerable because it exposed something slavery. Depended on concealing domination did not produce the complete obedience its defenders claimed. Vale responded in the language of property. If the pulpit had become dangerous, destroy the pulpit. Men entered the chapel with tools. Elias was forced to watch. The wooden structure he had built, repaired, touched, and used as cover was dismantled piece by piece. Boards were pulled apart. The front platform was broken down. The section where Elias's palm had struck so many signals was removed. Vale ordered future worship restricted. No more uncontrolled preaching. No more rhythmic participation beyond what supervisors considered acceptable. He believed he had removed the instrument. Rourke was not as certain. He understood now that the pulpit itself had never created the code, but he still believed it had served as the center. Remove the center, he reasoned, and the surrounding network would lose coordination. For a time, events seemed to prove him right. The plantation became quiet. The next evening passed without incident, then another. Rourke increased patrols anyway. He watched Elias during work. Nothing. He listened near the cabins after dark. Nothing. He began appearing unexpectedly near the stable and laundry structures. Still nothing. Vale interpreted the silence as success. Rourke began to do the same. That was when the first knock came from the stable. It was faint. A wooden handle against a stall rail. Rourke turned. The sound stopped. He walked into the stable and found routine work continuing. No one appeared alarmed. No one looked toward him. He searched for Elias. Elias was nowhere nearby. Rourke remained for several minutes. Nothing happened. He left. Later that night, another rhythm appeared near a work shed. Not identical, related. A short impact. Pause. Two softer sounds. Rourke moved toward it. Again the rhythm stopped before he arrived. The next day he questioned workers separately. Their answers gave him nothing useful. Hammering, repairs, tools, loose wood, ordinary sounds, all plausible. That was the problem. The system no longer required a pulpit because the plantation itself was full of surfaces that could carry rhythm. Fence posts, stable rails, buckets, wagon frames, doors, workbenches. The architecture of forced labor had become the architecture of communication. Rourke finally understood that destroying one object had changed almost nothing. He shifted his attention back to Elias. If Elias was still directing the signals, watching him should reveal the pattern. But several of the new rhythms appeared while Elias was clearly elsewhere. One sounded from the stable, while Elias worked near a gate. Another appeared after Elias had already been sent away from the chapel grounds. A confirmation traveled through a work area without Elias approaching it. That was when Rourke's theory began to break. He had assumed that every system required a commander. He had spent the entire investigation trying to identify that person. First Elias, then Lucette. Remove the sender, remove the system. It was the logic of a hierarchy. It was also the logic of the plantation itself. Orders flowed downward. Authority belonged to one place. Control depended on identifiable masters. Rourke had assumed resistance must work the same way. Elias and Lucette had built the opposite. They had taught principles instead of commands. People learned how tempo changed meaning. They learned that silence could reverse a familiar sequence. They learned how to confirm without gathering. They learned how to reproduce the method using whatever ordinary sounds existed around them. The code could change because those who understood it did not need Elias to repeat every instruction. The network no longer had a center. That was the final failure of Rourke's investigation. He had spent months trying to discover where the intelligence lived. By the time he understood, it lived everywhere. He could not isolate. Vale responded with more restrictions. Rourke responded with more watching. Neither solved the problem. Surveillance increased suspicion faster than it produced understanding. A hammer strike became suspicious. A door closing became suspicious. Footsteps became suspicious. Men began stopping work simply to listen. That disrupted the plantation more than the original signals had. Rourke had wanted certainty. Instead, he had created an environment where every ordinary sound could contain meaning. Elias saw the change. He did not celebrate it. Lucette was still gone. Nothing about the survival of the network repaired that fact. Her absence remained visible in the routines she no longer performed. No revelation erased the cost. That distinction matters. Resistance under slavery did not guarantee justice for those who created it. Victory could survive the person who paid for it. One evening, Elias stood near what remained of the chapel. The pulpit was gone. Only rough boards and disturbed flooring showed where it had stood. Vale had destroyed the physical symbol because he believed resistance could be dismantled like furniture. Elias looked at the empty space. He thought of Lucette's warning from months earlier. Listen to what comes between. Then a sound came from somewhere beyond the workyard. One knock. Elias did not move. Silence. Then two knocks. The pause was correct. The sequence was not a warning. It was not a request. It was confirmation. Someone else knew. Someone else had passed it on. Elias lifted his head. He never answered. He did not need to. The signal itself was the answer. Rourke could remove Lucette. Veil could destroy the pulpit. They could restrict worship and watch every visible gathering. What they could not do was force knowledge back into the hands of the people who had first created it. That was the weakness Elias and Lucette had exposed. Slavery depended on controlling bodies, movement, labor, and speech. But once a method had been learned collectively, there was no single throat to silence and no single object to break. The pulpit was gone. Lucette was gone. The rhythm survived. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more hidden histories of resistance, survival, and intelligence under slavery, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Then leave your theory. Did Ansel Rourke ever fully understand what Elias and Lucette had built? Or did he spend the rest of his life hearing codes in every knock, every footstep, and every silence?